Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a story that even 2 millennia later still packs a real punch, you know? It's the union between Emperor Nero and a young boy named Sporus, around 66 or 67 AD. And whenever this comes up, you always hear the same question. Was this Rome's first gay marriage? It's a really catchy hook, makes you think. But it asks us to sort of map our modern ideas about love, identity, legal rights onto this ancient world that ran on totally different rules, hierarchy, status, power.
That's exactly right. And here on the deep dive, we know the real story is always, well, messier, darker, and way more complicated legally than any simple headline.
Yeah, absolutely.
So our mission today is to really break this down using, history, law, social context. We need to get past the scandal sheet version and figure out if this relationship, with all its rituals, could possibly have counted as justum matrimonium, a proper legal Roman marriage.
Or if it was something else entirely.
Or if, as the evidence really points, the whole elaborate ceremony was just a performance, a kind of institutional parody, cooked up by Nero to show everyone just how much power he had, how little the rules meant to him.
And we should probably say right up front, before we even get to the ceremony itself, Nero had already made it legally impossible. Because at the time he married Sporus, he was already legally married to someone else, right? Statilia Messalina.
Yes, exactly. Which means, straight out of the gate, Roman law says no. Monogamy was the rule. Full stop.
So legally void from the start.
Utterly void. But Nero's move here was so public, so blatant, that to really get a handle on the damage he was doing to the social order, we kind of need to look at it through 3 different lenses.
Okay, what are those?
Well, first, there's the historiography. We absolutely have to understand who wrote this stuff down and why, because, spoiler alert, they hated Nero.
Right, the sources aren't exactly objective.
Not even close. Then second, we need to nail down the hard legal facts. All the ways Roman law just flat out denied this union any legitimacy. That turns the ceremony into, well, just theater.
Okay.
And finally, we place it all in that brutal context of Roman sexuality. It's all about status, gender roles, and ultimately imperium, that total imperial power being flexed over another human being. This really isn't a story about preference, it's about power.
Got it. So let's start with those sources then, the historiography.
Okay, so if we're going to understand this whole Sporus affair, we have to start with some serious source criticism. You can't just read what Suetonius or Dio Cassius wrote and take it at face value. You miss the whole political game.
Right. These are the main guys who tell us about Nero, Suetonius with his Lives of the 12 Caesars, and Dio Cassius with his Roman history. And you're saying they were hostile.
Hostile's putting it mildly. They were writing generations after Nero, and their view was fundamentally negative. You have to understand their agenda.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why the hostility? I mean, Nero died after a coup. The end of his dynasty wasn't pretty. He gets labeled the worst emperor. But why were later historians so obsessed with detailing every sexual scandal?
Well, it wasn't really personal dislike, like they knew him. It was political, institutional. Both Suetonius and Dio Cassius were operating under later dynasties. Suetonius under the Flavians, Dio under the Severans.
Okay, so new emperors are in charge.
Exactly. And these new imperial families needed to legitimize their own rule. What's the best way to do that?
Make previous guys look really, really bad.
Precisely. You paint the Julian-Claudians, and especially Nero, as the absolute pits of moral corruption. This degeneracy, they argued, is why the Flavians had to take over, why the Severans brought stability. Nero, with all his artistic pretensions and frankly weird behavior, became the perfect foil, the ultimate symbol of what goes wrong when an emperor loses control.
So they needed a villain to make their own patrons look like heroes. They're basically writing propaganda after the fact.
It's definitely got a strong propagandistic element. They're shaping the historical narrative to serve a present political purpose.
But hang on, if we just dismiss everything as propaganda, aren't we in danger of ignoring what might have actually happened? I mean, the ceremony with Sporus seems to have been pretty public. How do we separate the political spin from the, undeniable facts?
That's the crucial balancing act. We don't deny the event happened, the union, the ceremony that seems solid, but we have to be critical about how they tell the story, the details they emphasize, the context they wrap it in. Look at Suetonius, for example.
Yeah.
He doesn't just mention Sporus in passing, no. He strategically slots this relationship into this horrifying list of Nero's supposed sexual crimes.
Right. You mentioned earlier he puts it right between alleged incest with his mother and the rape of a Vestal virgin.
Yeah. It's incredibly powerful framing. It's like building a legal case through narrative structure. By placing the Sporus union there, he forces you, the reader, to see it not just as an odd or illegal personal choice, but as absolute proof of Nero's monstrous character. It becomes Exhibit A in the case for why Nero was fundamentally unfit to rule Rome.
It's like historical character assassination through chapter layout.
Exactly. It's a form of damnatio memoria, condemning the memory achieves through careful writing. It guides you to the conclusion they want you to reach.
And this framing dictates the details they focus on too, right? Like the wedding ceremony itself.
Absolutely. They make a point of mentioning the specifics, the dowry, the bridal veil, the public parade. Now, if they just wanted to report an illicit relationship, those details might be secondary. But they stress them. Why?
To make it seem even more outrageous.
Precisely. They weaponize Nero's own love of spectacle against him. The real scandal, for the Roman elite reading this later, wasn't necessarily just the sex act itself. I mean, as we'll discuss, a powerful man penetrating a lower status male wasn't unheard of, especially in private.
Okay.
The real crime, the sacrilege that justified Nero's downfall in their eyes, was the public use of traditional marriage symbols, the veil, the dowry, the public announcements for this completely illegitimate union.
So he was appropriating the sacred forms of Roman tradition, the mos maiorum, these ancestral customs.
He was defiling them. The mos maiorum was the bedrock of Roman identity. Marriage was central to family, inheritance, social order. By documenting Nero using these forms for a legally impossible, non-procreative union, the historians framed it as a direct attack on the foundations of Roman civilization itself.
Wow.
It provided the perfect moral justification for getting rid of him. His performance proved his contempt for Rome's core values.
So it's not a love story gone wrong. It's political theater recorded by his enemies to seal his terrible reputation. That really changes how you see it.
It has to. Otherwise, you're just reading the prosecution's closing argument without understanding the charges.
Okay, so let's shift focus now to the other person in this parody, Sporus himself. The story around him is just incredibly dramatic, but it really highlights the coercion involved, doesn't it? And Nero's absolute need to dominate. It's a story of deliberate transformation.
It really is. And it starts right at the bottom rung of the social ladder. Our sources tell us Sporus was originally a slave, a boy with no status. That immediately sets the power dynamic.
Right. We know a high-status Roman man having sex with a subordinate was basically an expression of power. The fact Sporus starts as a slave just emphasizes Nero's total control from the beginning.
Complete and utter control. A slave was property, legally speaking.
Yeah.
No rights, no standing, certainly no right to connubium, the right to contract a legal marriage. Sporus's low status wasn't just incidental, it was the necessary starting point for Nero's grand performance of Imperium. But Nero didn't leave it there. He then engineers this total transformation of Sporus's legal and physical being.
Which brings us to the most shocking detail, the castration. Nero had him castrated, making him legally a eunuch.
This is the absolute pivot point. It's an irreversible act of physical control. It removes Sporus from the category of even a low-status Roman male and puts him into this other sort of liminal category. Eunuchs weren't unknown in Rome, but they are often associated with Eastern courts.
Oh yeah, seen as kind of foreign, luxurious, maybe decadent, like advisors or chamberlains in Hellenistic kingdoms.
Exactly. They were seen as politically safe sometimes because they couldn't father heirs, couldn't start their own dynasties. But in Rome, it had connotations of the exotic, maybe the corrupting influence of the East. By making Sporus a eunuch, Nero was doing several things. Asserting physical control, placing Sporus outside normal Roman masculinity, and maybe even adopting the trappings of those Eastern monarchies he seemed to admire.
And this physical transformation ties into that really strange substitution idea. The sources claim Sporus looked uncannily like Nero's dead wife, Poppaea Sabina.
And Dio Cassius even says Nero started calling Sporus by Poppaea's name.
So what's going on there? Is it grief? Guilt? I mean, the story is Nero killed Poppaea, kicked her when she was pregnant. Maybe this was his twisted way of dealing with that.
That's one interpretation the sources hint at, that he's haunted by Poppaea and trying to recreate her, maybe to soothe his conscience. It paints him as psychologically tormented.
But knowing Nero and focusing on the power angle, is there another way to read it?
I think the more compelling reading, especially given everything else, is that it's the ultimate display of power. Forget guilt. Think about what it means for an emperor to kill his wife and then publicly replace her with a castrated boy who he forces everyone to acknowledge as her replacement.
It's like he's saying, I can literally rewrite reality. I can bring back the dead, change genders, redefine institutions, all at my whim.
Exactly. Sporus becomes this living symbol of Nero's hubris. He's not just a substitute lover, he's an institutional replacement, forced into the role of empress. It's a terrifying demonstration of the emperor's power to reshape the world according to his desires.
So the transformation is slave to eunuch to Poppaea's stand-in. And all this culminates in the wedding ceremony, the nuptiae. You said the sources stress how meticulously Nero followed the traditional forms.
They do. Suetonius is specific. All of the usual ceremonies, including a dowry and a bridal veil, this wasn't some back alley affair, it was a full-blown public ritual. Dio Cassius adds that Nero made a huge public spectacle of it, demanding senators and officials attend and basically witness this legal farce.
Let's talk about that dowry for a second. That detail seems particularly pointed. A dowry was property the bride's family gave the groom, right? For supporting the wife and potential kids.
Yes, and crucially, it usually had to be returned if the marriage ended. It symbolized the creation of a legitimate family unit with heirs, so demanding a dowry for Sporus, a castrated boy, possibly still legally Nero's property if not formally freed, was just a complete mockery.
It's like forcing the bureaucracy to participate in the insult, using the legal paperwork of marriage for something that fundamentally couldn't be marriage.
It demonstrates contempt for the entire system. It shows that the emperor's decree, however absurd, overrides the actual law and its purpose. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was making the state apparatus complicit in the charade.
And it was very public. Sporus, dressed in the finery of the empresses, carried in a litter like an elite woman.
Paraded around. Nero took him everywhere, not just hidden away in the palace. He took him to Greece, to the public markets and law courts. He took him along the Street of the Images in Rome, this really prominent place. And apparently Nero would publicly kiss him in these spaces.
Forcing everyone to see it, to acknowledge it.
Forcing the elite, the senators, the judges, the public, to witness and implicitly accept this completely illegal union. It just shattered the boundary between the emperor's private whims and the public legal order.
And we should also touch on the role-playing aspect compared to his earlier marriage to Pythagoras or Dorphorus.
Ah, yes, that's important too. In that earlier relationship, Nero famously played the passive role, the bride, sponsor.
Yeah.
With Sporus, Nero is firmly the active partner, the husband, vir. This shift is significant. It shows Nero claiming mastery over the entire spectrum of Roman sexual roles. He could play the dominant male, feminizing and controlling Sporus, showcasing his raw power.
And he could also play the passive role, which was seen as degrading for an elite man, showing contempt for those norms too.
Exactly. It demonstrated a complete disregard for the expected boundaries of elite masculinity. But the Sporus union, with Nero as the active vir, was framed by the historians more directly as tyranny power imposed through domination.
And just to wrap up this section, that detail about the ring Sporus supposedly gave Nero near the end, the one depicting the rape of Proserpina, that's just chillingly symbolic.
It really is. The myth itself is about power, abduction, forced Pluto, the god of the underworld, seizing a young maiden. The sources highlighting this detail serve as a kind of final commentary on the whole relationship.
Like it confirms the interpretation that this was founded on coercion, not affection, and maybe foreshadows Nero's own violent end.
Contemporaries certainly seem to read it that way as a terrible omen. It connects Nero directly to that archetype of the violent tyrant Hades Pluto, reinforcing the idea that his power was illegitimate and destructive. The ring becomes the perfect, grim symbol for the whole affair. Okay, so we've talked about the hostile historians and the disturbing theater of it all, but now we need to get really precise, legally speaking. Could this union in any universe have been considered a valid Roman marriage? The answer, based on Roman law, the Jurius Civil, is an emphatic no.
Right. Roman marriage matrimonium wasn't really about love or companionship in the modern sense, was it? It had a very specific practical purpose.
Absolutely. Its primary function was socioeconomic and institutional. It was designed, first and foremost, for the production of legitimate children liberi who could inherit property, carry on the family name, and be Roman citizens. It was deeply tied into property law, citizenship, and keeping the Roman state going. A wife, a mater, was literally defined by her potential to be a mother.
Okay, so what were the absolute must-haves for it to be considered iustum matrimonium, a legally valid marriage?
Several key things. The big one was connubium. That's the legal capacity to contract a marriage that would produce legitimate citizen children. Usually, both parties needed to be Roman citizens. But connubium itself depended on a few conditions.
And I bet Nero and Sporus failed on multiple counts here.
Oh, spectacularly. First, you needed to reach the legal age of puberty that was generally set at 14 for boys, 12 for girls. Second, you needed the right legal status, again, usually citizen status, although there were some complexities. And third, this is really important for understanding the social structure. You needed a formal consent of the patres familias, the heads of the families involved.
Wait, even if the couple were adults, they still needed permission from their fathers or patriarchs?
In many cases, yes. The power of the paterfamilias, the male head of household, was immense in Roman law. He often held patria potestas, which was near absolute authority over his descendants, regardless of their age. It really underscores that marriage wasn't just about two individuals. It was an alliance between families, structured hierarchically.
Okay. What else? Was intent important?
Yes, very much so. The jurists talked about affectio maritalis. This was the mutual intention of the couple to live together in a permanent union for the purpose of having legitimate children. Even if all the forms were followed, if that underlying intent wasn't there, it wasn't truly matrimonium.
So even if Nero went through the motions, you could argue the fundamental intent required by law was missing given the nature of the relationship.
Absolutely. This was clearly an imperial power play, a spectacle, not a genuine attempt to form a lasting family unit in the eyes of the law. That lack of affectio maritalis, in the legal sense, is another nail in the coffin.
Okay, let's take off the specific legal barriers then. Barrier number 1, monogamy. You mentioned this earlier.
This is the simplest one. Roman law demanded strict monogamy for legal marriage. Nero was already married to Stutelia Messalina. End of story. Attempting a second marriage, regardless of who it was with, was legally impossible. Bigamy was not allowed. The union with Sporus was instantly void on this ground alone.
Crystal clear. So even if Sporus had been, say, a Roman noblewoman, it still wouldn't have been legal because Nero was already married.
Correct. That's the first uncrossable line. But barrier number 2 gets more into the specifics of Sporus himself. The eunuch prohibition.
Ah, so the castration wasn't just a symbolic act. It had direct legal consequences for marriage.
Huge consequences. Roman legal scholars, the jurists, explicitly stated that eunuchs lacked connubium. Why? Because they couldn't fulfill the fundamental procreative purpose of marriage. The law required the potential for legitimate offspring.
Wow.
Sporus' castration was therefore an absolute legal bar. Some jurists even debated if a eunuch could technically be considered to have reached puberty in the eyes of the law, since procreative capacity was so linked to legal adulthood for marital purposes.
That's fascinating. So the physical act legally erased his capacity to marry, according to Roman legal thinking.
It disqualified him completely. The law was structured to maintain the citizen body and ensure orderly inheritance. A union that was biologically incapable of producing heirs couldn't be recognized as matrimonium. This legal and moral view helps explain why the whole thing was so offensive to the traditional Roman elite.
Okay, and barrier number 3, status impediments. Sporus started as a slave.
Right. Marriage between a citizen and a slave, iustum matrimonium, was impossible. Slaves were property. Now, Nero almost certainly would have manumitted Sporus, freed him before the ceremony. But even as a freedman, especially combined with his status as a eunuch, marriage to a high-status citizen like the emperor was still legally problematic, if not impossible.
Yeah.
Even the less formal union of concubinatus, which was a stable cohabitation without full marital rights, usually involved a freed woman, not a castrated freedman.
So every way you look at it legally, it just doesn't work. Low status, eunuch status, lack of procreative capacity, lack of affectio maritalis, and the big one, Nero was already married.
Exactly. Nero basically picked the most legally fraught combination possible: bigamy. A eunuch partner of low and questionable status, no possibility of heirs, and then deliberately overlaid it with the most sacred forms of Roman marriage.
The dowry, the veil.
All of it. It was, legally speaking, a matrimonium non iustum, a non-marriage, a legal nullity. But the performance, the public ritual, transformed it into this deliberate imperial parody. It was Nero shouting to the Senate, to the elites, look, your laws, your traditions, they mean nothing next to my power. I can do this and you will watch.
It wasn't just breaking the law, it was rubbing their noses in it.
Precisely. It was a calculated act of political defiance, showing the emperor was above the very system he was supposed to uphold. That visible attack on institutions was far more dangerous politically than any private sexual activity.
Okay, so we've nailed the legal side. It was impossible. But the outrage wasn't just legalistic, was it? For the Roman elite, this wasn't just a bureaucratic error. It was deeply offensive on a cultural and moral level. If the law said void, the culture said, well, something much worse, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. And to understand that cultural reaction, we have to reiterate, Roman society didn't think about sexuality like we do. There wasn't a concept of gay or straight based on attraction. It was all about status and role, specifically the role in penetration.
Right. It wasn't about the gender of your partner so much as your social standing relative to them,
Yep.
and whether you were the active or passive participant.
Exactly. For an elite Roman man, displaying dominance, virtus, was crucial. Penetrating someone of lower status, whether that was a woman, a slave, a prostitute, or even a lower status male, was generally seen as a normal expression of his masculine power and social superiority. It reinforced his position.
So Nero having sex with a male slave like Sporus in private wouldn't necessarily have been the big scandal.
Not necessarily the act itself, if kept discreet. That was just exercising his power over property. The real social death, the profound degradation, came if an elite Roman man took the passive receptive role, the role of the senatus.
And that term, senatus, was loaded with negativity, wasn't it?
Hugely loaded. It was one of the worst insults you could throw at a Roman man. It implied infamia, a loss of legal and social standing. It suggested weakness, effeminacy, a lack of self-control, almost like a disease, morbus. In a society built on military strength and conquest, being penetrated was equated with being conquered. It meant you were weak, unmanly, unfit for leadership.
Okay, so applying that lens to Sporus, he was deliberately engineered into that ultimate passive, feminized role.
Absolutely. He wasn't just passive, he was made physically incapable of being anything else through castration. Then he was dressed in the finery of the empresses, publicly displayed in a way that emphasized this imposed femininity. Sporus became a living symbol of subordination. Nero used his imperial power, his imperium, not just to break laws, but to publicly warp gender norms and social boundaries. Sporus was the victim, the embodiment of Nero's claim that he could dictate physical, social, even gender reality.
So again, the scandal wasn't the sex act per se, but the institutionalization of it. Forcing the state, the public, to witness and acknowledge this extreme display of dominance through the sacred ritual of marriage.
That's the core of the offense to the elite political order. It took what might have been a private vice, from their perspective, and turned it into a public, state-sanctioned mockery of everything they held dear. It was the theatricality and the forced public acceptance that made it a political crisis.
And this becomes even clearer when you contrast Sporus with that earlier marriage to Pythagoras, or Dorophorus. With Sporus, Nero is the dominant husband, the vir.
Yes. Dominating Sporus, however offensively, still fit within the broad paradigm of elite male power over subordinate. But with Dorophorus, Nero played the passive bride, the sponsa. Suetonius gives us that shocking detail about him mimicking the cries of a virgin being deflowered.
Why was that act Nero playing the passive role maybe even more disturbing or indicative of madness to the senatorial class?
Because it was a fundamental violation of elite Roman masculinity from the inside. For the emperor himself to willingly take the penetrated role, especially in a public ceremony with a freedman, someone technically subordinate even if freed was seen as utter madness. It demonstrated a complete lack of gravitas, of self-discipline, the very qualities expected of a Roman leader.
So it showed he couldn't even control himself, let alone the empire.
Precisely. The hostile biographers seized on this. It was perfect evidence for them of his instability, his degeneracy. By violating both sides of the sexual hierarchy, dominating Sporus publicly and submitting to Dorophorus publicly, Nero showed he had zero respect for any Roman norms.
So for Suetonius and Dio Cassius, it wasn't about understanding Nero's psychology or sexuality. It was just about piling up examples of how his behavior systematically broke every rule of elite conduct, making him politically radioactive and justifying his removal.
Exactly. Both relationships, active and passive, served their narrative purpose beautifully. They provided ample ammunition to paint Nero as the ultimate bad emperor, completely out of sync with Roman values. And the tragedy for Sporus, of course, didn't end when Nero died. In fact, once Nero was gone, Sporus' identity became entirely defined by his association with the hated emperor. He effectively became political baggage, weaponized in the chaos that followed.
Yeah, let's circle back quickly to that ring, the rape of Proserpina 1. You said the historians make sure to include that detail. It really does cast a long shadow, doesn't it?
It really does. That image of violent seizure Pluto dragging Proserpina to the underworld becomes the perfect metaphor for the historian's interpretation of the Nero-Sporus relationship. By highlighting it, they permanently link Nero's memory to tyranny and force, reinforcing their political argument about his rule.
And Sporus was right there at the very end. When Nero fled Rome in June 68, knowing the jig was up, Sporus was one of just 4 companions who stayed with him before his suicide.
He was. which meant as soon as Nero was dead, Sporus' fate was sealed. He was immediately caught up in the whirlwind of the year of the four emperors. He essentially became property changing hands, a human trophy passed to Otho, the second emperor in that messy year.
Otho. Why Otho specifically? Was there a connection?
A very pointed one, it seems. Years before, Nero had actually forced Otho to divorce his own wife, and that wife was Poppaea Sabina, the very woman Sporus was said to resemble, and whose name Nero sometimes used for him.
Wow. So Otho taking possession of Sporus, it's like a really twisted form of revenge.
It looks that way. It's deeply symbolic. Otho isn't just acquiring a eunuch from the previous regime, he's acquiring the living effigy of his stolen wife. It's like he's reclaiming something Nero took, getting a measure of political and maybe deeply personal satisfaction by possessing this reminder of Nero's transgressions against him.
But Otho didn't last long either. Only about 3 months, then he's defeated by Vitellius. So Sporus changes hands again.
Yes, captured by Vitellius's forces. And Vitellius, the third emperor that year, seemed determined to make a very public statement about purging all things Neronian. His plan for Sporus was horrific, designed as the ultimate public spectacle of erasure.
What was the plan? You mentioned execution in the arena.
Yes, but not just any execution. Vitellius decreed that Sporus would be killed as part of a gladiatorial spectacle, forced into a fatal public reenactment of the rape of Proserpina.
No, the myth from the ring.
The very same myth. Think about the sheer cruelty and political calculation of that. It wasn't just killing him, it was a state-sponsored ritual designed to publicly confirm the historian's framing of the relationship. It would force Sporus to embody that myth of violation one last time.
Making him the ultimate passive victim, the senatus publicly shamed and destroyed in front of the entire city as a symbol of Neronian corruption.
Exactly. It was meant to be the final, official confirmation of Nero's depravity performed on the body of his most infamous companion. The ultimate infamia, the public degradation, was arguably worse than death itself in Roman eyes.
So, what happened? Did the execution go ahead?
No. Faced with this prospect, this absolute extreme of public humiliation and political exploitation, Sporus took the only path left to him. He committed suicide sometime in 69 AD.
He chose his own end.
He did. It was his final, tragic act of agency. By killing himself, Sporus denied Vitellius his gruesome spectacle. He prevented his body from being used as the ultimate piece of official anti-Nero propaganda. After a life completely defined and controlled by others, particularly Nero, his death was, in a way, his own. A terribly sad end, but perhaps the only control he ever really had. #tag outro.
So bringing this all together, this deep dive really makes it clear, doesn't it? Trying to shoehorn the Nero-Sporus union into our modern ideas about marriage equality or sexual identity just completely misses the point of what was actually happening in ancient Rome.
Absolutely. The synthesis is pretty stark, really, legally. The union was an impossibility. It failed on every single requirement. Monogamy, status, the capacity and intent for procreation, the ceremony itself. It was pure imperial parity and power display. It was Nero demonstrating his absolute tyrannical dominance over a powerless individual.
So calling it gay marriage isn't just anachronistic. It actively misrepresents the situation. It ignores the coercion, the hierarchy, the specific rules of Roman sexuality and law.
Exactly. The story survives not as some early example of same-sex unions, but as a notorious scandal. It's documented precisely because it was seen as such an outrageous example of unchecked imperial power, providing the justification needed to bring Nero down.
Which leads us to that final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah, think about this. The sources, the historians like Suetonius and Dio Cassius, who were hostile to Nero, they deliberately recorded all those ceremonial details, the dowry, the veil, the public kisses. They did it specifically to maximize the sense of sacrilege, to build their case that Nero was unfit to rule based on these moral failings.
So, if history is written, or at least heavily shaped, by political enemies using moral scandal as their main weapon, how much does that affect how we judge leaders, both past and present?
Right. How many other historical figures have had their legacies defined primarily by perceived violations of social or sexual norms, maybe overshadowing their actual governance, good or bad? Where do we draw the line between condemning genuinely tyrannical behavior and just participating in politically motivated character assassination?
It really makes you question how historical narratives are constructed and whose interests they serve. The deep dive ends here, but as always, your own exploration continues.